had spent 1 day in the counterintelligence prison at Army headquarters and 3 days in the counterintelligence prison at the headquarters of the front, where my cellmates had educated me in the deceptions practiced by the interrogators, their threats and beatings, and the fact that once a person was arrested, he was never released, and in the inevitability of a 10-year sentence. And then by miracle I had suddenly burst out of there and for 4 days had traveled like a free person among free people, even though my flanks had already lain on rotten straw beside the latrine bucket. My eyes had already beheld beaten up and sleepless men. My ears had heard the truth, and my mouth had tasted prison gruel. So why did I keep silent? Why, in my last minute out in the open, did I not attempt to enlighten the hoodwinked crowd? I kept silent, too, in the polished city of Brodnica, but maybe they didn't understand Russian there. I didn't call out one word in the streets of Byalostok, but maybe it wasn't a matter that concerned the Poles. I didn't utter a sound at Volkovysk station, but there were very few people there. I walked along the Minsk station platform beside those same bandits as if nothing at all were amiss, but the station was still a ruin. And now I was leading the Smersh men through the circular upper courses of the Byelorussian radial subway station on the Moscow Circle line, with its white-ceilinged dome and brilliant electric lights, and opposite us 2 parallel escalators, thickly packed with Muscovites, rising from below. It seemed as though they were all looking at me. They kept coming in an endless ribbon from down there, from the depths of ignorance. On and on beneath the gleaming dome, reaching toward me for at least one word of truth. So why did I keep silent? Every man always has handy a dozen glib little reasons why he is not right to sacrifice himself. Some still have hopes of a favorable outcome to their cases and are afraid to ruin their chances by an outcry. For, after all, we got no news from the other world, and we do not realize that from the very moment of our arrest, our fate was almost certainly been decided in the worst possible sense, and that we cannot make it any worse. Others have not yet attained to the mature concepts on which a shout of protest to the crowd must be based. Indeed, only a revolutionary has slogans on his lips that are crying to be uttered aloud. And where would the uninvolved, peaceable, average man come by such slogans? He simply does not know what to shout. And then, last of all, there's the person whose heart is too full of emotion, whose eyes have seen too much, for that whole ocean to pour forth in a few disconnected cries. As for me, I kept silent for one further reason, because those Muscovites thronging the steps of the escalators were too few for me. Too few. Here my cry would be heard by 200, or twice 200, but what of the 200 million? Vaguely, unclearly, I had a vision that some day I would cry out to the 200 million. But for the time being, I did not open my mouth, and the escalator dragged me implacably down into the nether world. And when I got to Akhotmy Riad, I continued to keep silent. Nor did I utter a cry at Metropole Hotel, nor wave my arms on the Golgotha of Lubyanka Square. Thank you for listening to the Well-Ordered Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stanley, and today we are beginning the podcast series that has been in the works since the summer of 2018. This book is when I realized that I can't communicate enough in ordinary conversations, and I need a space to voice some of the most profound ideas that I stumble across in my reading. The Gulag Archipelago, a 1,500-page, 3-volume monstrosity of a book written by Aleksander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn didn't stop writing because he had finished the work. Instead, he stopped writing because he got bored. And after 10 years of writing between 1958 and 1968, he just said, "All right, it's good enough. This has taken too many years of my life, and it's already a little too long. Okay, a lot too long. Other writers are going to have to pick up where I left off." What is the Gulag Archipelago? First of all, what does it mean? The word Gulag is a Russian acronym referencing the forced labor prison system in the Soviet Union. An archipelago is a constellation of small islands. So the Gulag Archipelago is a word picture highlighting the hundreds of prison camps that existed across Russia, which stand in isolation and secrecy. Lenin set up these forced labor camps for the deplorables who disagreed with him politically. When the Russian economy began to fail, Stalin filled the prison camps with millions of innocent people, in order to extract slave labor from skilled and unskilled workers alike. The Gulag Archipelago begins when Solzhenitsyn is still in the military during World War II. He's an artillery captain, serving as a good Russian does. He's then arrested for criticizing Stalin in a letter to a friend and serves about an 8 to 10 year prison sentence in the Gulag. And then he goes into exile and attempts to evade the secret police and publish his book in the West. In the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn documents all of his experiences, as well as the experiences of everyone he meets. He documents Stalin's rise to power, the way he maneuvered to change laws and slowly subject the country through fear and propaganda. He ties some of the Soviet Union's corruption back to Lenin when people started blaming Stalin when things got sour. But most importantly, Solzhenitsyn documents the complacency and the contributions of everyday people which allow true evil to grip a nation for nearly a century. The Gulag Archipelago is hailed as one of the most important books of the 20th century, playing an integral part in discrediting communism in the Western world. While Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre were too busy praising communism to notice the millions of people who were dying in government-run concentration camps, it was Solzhenitsyn who was exposing what life in a Marxist utopia is really like. Some journalists, like Malcolm Muggeridge or George Orwell, were discovering for themselves the millions of corpses. But this could be chalked up to Western propaganda or whatever. The leftist professors just blamed Stalin for failing to usher the utopia. If only it weren't for the cult of personality, his personal lust for power, then we could have seen what real communism is capable of. But it was Solzhenitsyn who traced the evil back to the philosophy of the revolutionaries, who said that they wanted compassion for the poor, but really wanted death to the rich. It was Solzhenitsyn who wrote this book from the darkness, survived the horrors, evaded the spies and informers, refuted the lies, and eventually contributed to the downfall of not just the Soviet Union, but the credibility of communism wherever it was practiced. He bought us a few more decades of freedom and provided the lessons to teach future generations about the seductive and destructive nature of communism. It is a good thing he didn't call out in the Metropole Hotel, nor wave his arms in the Uritsky Square, because the premonitions of a poet came true. Solzhenitsyn did cry to the millions. But now, only 32 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, my generation has near completely forgotten about the poison of collectivist ideology. There's now an abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago for everyday readers if you want to catch the highlights and get a feel for this important work. Solzhenitsyn was consulted personally and approved of both abridged versions, the first in 2002 and the second in 2018. In the foreword to the first abridgment, Solzhenitsyn writes, quote, "I dedicate this to all those who did not live to tell it, and may they please forgive me for not having seen it all, nor remembered it all, not having divined it all. If it were possible for any nation to fathom another people's bitter experience through a book, how much easier its future fate would become, and how many calamities and mistakes it could avoid. But it is very difficult. There always is this fallacious belief it would not be the same here. Here, such things are impossible. Alas, the evils of the 20th century are possible everywhere on earth. Yet I have not given up hope that human beings and nations may be able, in spite of all, to learn from the experiences of other people without having to live through it personally." End quote. Over this and the next few episodes, I'm going to extract the most memorable lessons that I gleaned from the Gulag Archipelago. As you may expect by now, I was more interested in Solzhenitsyn's spiritual and intellectual journey rather than his political one or his historical details. Solzhenitsyn starts out as a communist in the story, and eventually makes the paramount discovery that evil does not run between party lines or economic classes, but through every human heart. Solzhenitsyn will also discover the same truth as Viktor Frankl did in the Nazi concentration camps, that happiness and the ability to find meaning in life, despite tremendous suffering, lies in the fabric of what it means to be human. I hope you enjoy the historical, political, and spiritual journey that is the Gulag Archipelago. Thank you once again for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. Please like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, and most importantly, leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or however you're listening. Those simple, fast, and thoughtful reviews really help spread the podcast to others who might enjoy it. A 5-star review and your honest feedback does a lot for the algorithms. And of course, I read every comment and review and cherish them. Finally, if you've benefited from the podcast or believe in our mission, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. There, you will also find interesting quotes, sources, articles, and more available free of charge. If your contribution would cause any amount of financial pressure, please do not even consider it. But for those who are willing and able to give, it is because of your gift that the podcast can continue and even grow. So thank you. We'll begin with some context. Most of this is actually going to come straight from Solzhenitsyn, so we're basically already talking about the book. But we've spent a lot of time on the podcast discussing Russian history and Russian literature. And one of the reasons for that is because it's very important to get the full picture for some of these great works. And it's vital to remember that the Enlightenment encroached upon Europe very slowly. From Descartes to Kant, there's a wide variety of slow philosophical changes that eventually produce the fairly stable, wealthy Western democracies that we see today. One of the reasons for the stability is because there was a long time for the principles from the Magna Carta to eventually become the fully realized Constitution of the United States. In Russia, however, the ideas from the West slammed into the culture like a Mack truck in the late 19th century. You basically have the monarchy of Nicholas I and his successor, Nicholas II, and then during World War I, you have a post-Enlightenment Marxist communist revolution. Instead of going from the Magna Carta in 1215, and then the Reformation, and then the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, instead of bathing in thinkers from Hobbes to Locke to Rousseau for 200 years, the Russians go straight from essentially a medieval monarchism all the way to Marxist-Leninism in a decade. They got the most pure form of Marxism that any social scientist could ever ask for. I talked a lot about this when discussing Dostoevsky, but the fact of the matter is that it's difficult to understand how different Russian culture and history is because of these factors. The Decembrist Revolution in 1825 frees the slave servant class that we read about in Tolstoy, and then we have a slow industrialization of Russia as Marxist, socialist, and utopian ideas continue to spread. Dostoevsky is writing in this period. He's writing heavily. Crime and Punishment is published in 1866. The Devils is published in 1871. Brothers Karamazov, 1879. And all of these works heavily criticize the utopian Marxist ideas that posit that the root of man's trouble is socioeconomic. Dostoevsky predicted the horrors of socialism, emphasizing that the human condition cannot be solved with a rearrangement of social or economic status. Dostoevsky's exhortations for the soul of Russian culture to return to Orthodox Christianity are ignored, and revolution is palpable in the early 20th century. Nicholas II could barely hold on to his power. Food shortages and losses on the World War I front led to Nicholas II finally stepping down from power and going into exile. A provisional government was established by his younger brother in what is called the February Revolution. Socialists had total control over the government, and the debate quickly became who gets to define socialism? Who's going to be in charge, and how are they going to rule? And at this point, there are two primary parties vying for power in the provisional government. And these parties are the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks were a more moderate socialist. They were sympathetic to liberal values of free speech, democracy even, individual rights, that sort of a thing. But the Bolsheviks were true communists. They're communists that we're going to continue to see in world history. And they believed that they were ushering in a better world, and that they were willing to use violence and political terrorism in order to usher in a utopia. Anyone who got in their way was a class enemy. The Bolshevik Party is the manifestation of the impulse, if only you would all just shut up and let me run things for a few years, then you would see that I'm right. Have you ever been tempted by that thought? I know I have certainly been tempted by that thought. But that's the impulse of the totalitarian, and that's what Marxism requires. Marx himself said that there will have to be bloodshed in order to overthrow the oppressive class. Reason and freedom won't do it. Marxism requires a prison for people who disagree with you. The problem is that as you liquidate the oppressor class, the definition of oppressor class continues to broaden. Your labor camps fill up, and the bodies stack up. And that's what we saw in Russia, Cambodia, China, Africa, and South America. Body counts in the hundreds of millions. But like Stalin said, the death of one man is a tragedy, and the death of a million is a statistic. Don't communist slogans sound so nice? Here's another one from a French intellectual. The ideal society would take from each according to his ability and give to each according to his needs. Jordan Peterson quips that sounds really great when you think about it for 15 minutes, but when you think about it for 15 months, you realize how absolutely murderous it is. The key issue is this: who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what your ability is? Who gets to decide what your needs are? Capitalism assumes that the individual has the right to negotiate their own needs and their own abilities. But for communism, or really any socialistic system, the government gets to decide. That means either a dictator or a bureaucrat appointed by an elected official, and there's not that much difference when it comes down to the brass tacks of reality. They get to decide what you need and what you're capable of. Socialized medicine, socialized rations, socialized anything is when you give up your right to decide what you need, and you will give up your right to decide what you're willing to pay for. For those who have never had someone break this down, by the way, I really want to take a minute to articulate the difference between communism and socialism. Socialism is any system where we all do different amounts of input and get the same output. When I was a Boy Scout, selling caramel corn and bottled water at the fair, it doesn't matter if I sold 3 times my neighbor at the end of the day. All of our money went into a big pool and it was divided equally among everyone who showed up in a uniform. That's socialism. In healthcare, it doesn't matter what your needs are. This is the coverage that the government can afford to pay for you and your age group. This is what you're going to get. Communism, on the other hand, is when the government owns the means of production, meaning that the companies that make products or services, the oil industry, the food industry, whatever, the government owns all of it, and so they set the prices, they tell you what you can and cannot sell, and what you can and cannot buy. And the profits and losses just go straight to the government to pay for military expansion and political repression, at least if history has anything to say about it. Personal property is abolished in the ideal communist state. Okay, so communism is when the government owns the means of production, and socialism is when all of our contributions and inputs are different, but we get the same output. So anyway, the Mensheviks were kind of the majority of people. They were just more liberal socialists in Russia, but the Bolsheviks were true Marxists. And the Bolsheviks were led by none other than Vladimir Lenin, who, while the public are debating about the definitions of socialism and who will get to decide what socialism is and means and how far they go, Lenin seizes power in what is called the October Revolution of 1917, or the October Coup, as some historians call it, because he brushes aside all of the other socialists and he says, no, this is what we're doing. And it's important to know this because it's always the most radical and violent and strong-willed faction of a party that's going to declare themselves in charge. And this happens about 6 months after the original February Revolution. It's interesting. Later in the book, Solzhenitsyn is going to tell the story of a prison riot that turns into a really impressive standoff where the prisoners take over a facility and basically run the show and do whatever they want for about a month, about 40 days. This is called the 40 Days of Kengir. Eventually, the Soviets will send in paratroopers and tanks, and they end the rebellion. But Solzhenitsyn's telling of the story gives us a lot of insight into how revolutions and rebellions really work, how they start. For one, revolutions are really ugly because you're always basing your efforts on the bottom of the ethical barrel. The people who are joining the revolution and the people who start the revolution are the people who are willing to kill, firstly, and secondly, the people who don't respect authority. And of those people, the most power-hungry killers become the leaders. So it's not the ideologically moderate people who lead revolutions or win the day. And if you look at history, there really aren't any revolutions that were not catastrophes in some sense. The American Revolution comes to mind as a sole exception, but there are specific historical details that make it unique in that way. So, anyways, after the socialists overthrow the Tsar, it's Lenin and the Bolsheviks who end up in control of the government after 6 months or whatever, in the October Revolution, or coup. Lenin is the most committed killer and charismatic ideologue among the communists, and he saw himself as a true leader among men. Let me give you a little factoid about Lenin. Lenin loved music. He was a huge fan of Tchaikovsky, and he shattered all of his records because he thought that a love of music was a weakness. He thought that it softened his soul too much, that he wasn't going to be able to do the things that he needed to do if he listened to too much music. And that should tell you a little bit about the things that he thought that he would need to do in his position of power. So as soon as Lenin's in power, he invents a little thing called a concentration camp. That's right, Lenin invented the concentration camp. Well, sort of. Marx first was the one to write about the need of forced labor camps for prisoners, and we will see these re-education camps all the way up into the 21st century in modern-day China, actually. So these Marxist, Leninist concentration camps begin as early as 1917, and anyone who doesn't work or disagrees with Lenin or doesn't like Lenin's leadership decisions, or in the case of Nazi Germany is a different ethnicity, or same in China, current-day China, eventually they get their door kicked in at 3 a.m., and nobody hears from them ever again. They go off to these re-education camps, these concentration camps. But eventually people get the picture, and they stop protesting. Lenin started what history calls the Red Terror, where state-sponsored terrorism and mass killings are used in order to bring about their utopia, really silence opposition to their rule. Once there are no more protests and their power was stable, the Bolsheviks began what they called the Decologization of Russia. They also renamed themselves to the Communists, thinking that it was more befitting and friendly of a name. So, Decologization. A Gulag was a wealthy peasant, maybe a shop owner, a person who saved enough money to buy their own farm, really anyone who came from the upper class historically, or the upper middle class, or even if they came from the lower class, but they had accumulated enough wealth, they were successful in their entrepreneurship, in their businesses, whatever. These people are all rounded up and slaughtered, along with their families. Their farms are appropriated. They now belong to the government. And so anyone who wants to eat off of what was previously their farm are now stealing from the government. The government owns your farm now. This forced collectivization of property was really important to the Decolocization. And the result of the Decolocization, as you might guess, was a famine across all of Russia. Because all the farmers who were skilled enough to be successful at what they were doing, the farmers who knew what they were doing, they were all killed. And millions of Russians starved to death in these man-made famines. But it works out for the communists, because the last thing you want to do when you haven't eaten for 2 days is scold the government or try to start a revolution. After all, it's really the government is now the only one with the power to feed you. So suddenly, everyone loves the government, because if you don't love the government, you don't get to eat. Here's a quote from Stalin on Decologization. Quote, "In order to oust the Gulags as a class, the resistance of this class must be smashed in open battle, and it must be deprived of the productive sources of its existence and development. Free use of land, instruments of production, land renting, right to hire labor, etc. This is a turn towards the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class. Without it, talk about ousting the kulaks as a class is empty prattle, acceptable and profitable only to the right-wing deviators." End quote. The Western world doesn't know about this horrible thing going on in Russia yet. Public intellectuals are still praising and loving the progressive working-class new leader of Russia. And even to this day, there are statues of Lenin and posters of him that are worshipped with a strange cultic reverence all over the former USSR. Lenin eventually has a stroke in 1824, pretty early. He'd only been ruling for 5 years or so, if my math is right. A little more than that. Never do math while you're recording. And so he dies soon after. And Joseph Stalin takes his place, and he ramps up the political repression tenfold. The gulags continue to fill. and the starved and murdered corpses continue to stack up. At this point, the Soviets occupy the Ukraine, and they decolonize that. And so 10 million Ukrainians starved to death in the man-made famine called Holodomor in 1932. So once Stalin solidifies his power and becomes the de facto leader of the Bolsheviks, or the communists at this point, he has killed or imprisoned everyone who has threatened his power. Trotsky is erased from the history of the revolution. Among the communist oligarchy, Stalin has placed himself right in the middle of the seat of power, with everyone either swearing loyalty to him or dying, basically. The historian from Stanford, Stephen Kulkin, says that it's hard to convey the kind of power that Stalin had. He created a world superpower through his sheer logistical brilliance in the engine of fear built from the corpses of millions of people. Everyone was terrified that they might be the next to be sent to the gulags, and they knew how little it took to find themselves on that list. Solzhenitsyn tells the story of a meeting for government and military officials, and Stalin is one of the last to show up to the meeting. And when he does, everyone starts clapping for joy that he's arrived. Of course, we all have to hail our glorious leader. And as the clapping continues, everyone is kind of looking around, terrified to be the first one to stop clapping. And so eventually, the minutes drag on, and everybody is still clapping, offering standing ovations to Stalin. And pretty soon, the KGB are all looking around, waiting to see who the first one to stop clapping is going to be. Eventually, some of the older gentlemen literally start passing out after 15 minutes of applause for Stalin. And finally, someone had the courage to stop and straighten out his coat and sit down. Otherwise, legend might have it that they'd be clapping to this day. And the guy who stopped clapping didn't make it to the next meeting. He had an unscheduled appointment with the KGB and was never seen again. Anyone with the courage to stand up to the madness and stop clapping when everyone else is still clapping, well, that kind of defiance can certainly be seen as a threat. And so he was taken out of the picture. Stalin's gulags served a dual purpose. First, as a political intimidation tool. Nobody is going to speak out against the government if they know that you could spend 10, 15, 25 years in a hard labor camp for speaking out. Second, it was an economic tool. Free labor is awfully handy for an empire that has trouble feeding their own people. And so police departments would receive quotas for how many people they needed to arrest per week. The judicial system was completely taken over, and they would have these fake trials where judges and juries were bribed to send people off to the gulags. Article 5810, counter-revolutionary agitation, was universally accessible by anyone and handed out like candy. Teach your children to pray? Now, why would you do that when the party will take care of all of your needs? 15 years of hard labor. Some kids might get into a fight, and one of them gets shoved into a wall, knocking off a propaganda poster. 15 years for both of them. How dare you knock down our propaganda posters? That must mean you hate Stalin. The secret police would offer rewards for turning in enemies of the state, and that meant anyone that you denounced. After all, you can't take chances with these bourgeoisie oppressors. The logic was that it doesn't matter if you personally are guilty of a crime. We just want to know what your background is. What was your education like? Who were your grandparents? That will tell us all we need to know to determine whether you're a part of the oppressive class or not. The KGB began recruiting stoolies, government informers that would be rewarded if they reported on their neighbors. If you reported on someone and they got arrested, you were rewarded with a large sum of money, or maybe their apartment, or maybe their job. At first, the rewards were huge, but by the end, people would report their neighbors and sell their soul for a pack of cigarettes. At one point, 1 in 5 people were government informers in the Soviet Union. That means you can't say anything to anyone about what you really think. Family members would denounce you just to win an argument. And if someone you know was denounced and arrested, your failure to denounce them was reason enough for a 10-year prison sentence, Article 5812. That means as soon as one member of your family goes, it was only a matter of time before you're next. Because if you didn't denounce them, then you must have been with them. In response to this, some families would decide to intentionally denounce one member of their family altogether so that the rest of them might be spared. For most people, arrest meant police kicking in your door late at night, followed by a brief search of your belongings and in your lodgings, and then you were taken away and never heard from again. Everyone who was arrested had the same response. What? Under arrest? Me? What for? I've been a good communist. I'm a good comrade. But who knows? Unplugging your radio when a propaganda broadcast came on, or not shouting for the death of a traitor when they were paraded through the streets. Those are all good enough reasons to go to the gulags. It doesn't matter. 15 years under Article 5810, counter-revolutionary agitation. For some arrests, however, people would just get a notice in the mail, and they'd go to the police station themselves. After all, the police got lazy when they realized that almost no one ever resisted. And who could blame them? They didn't realize that their courts were completely corrupted after the Bolsheviks took over. A country is only ever as good as its courts. Solzhenitsyn tells the story of one man he met who was brought before a judge, and after he was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, he was coming out of the courthouse, and a guard asked him, "Hey, so what'd you do?" And the man was still speechless and stunned from the proceedings, and he said, I didn't do anything. The court officer seemed unfazed and just said, "Impossible. If you didn't do anything, you would have gotten 10 years. There are some people who were so terrified of being arrested, they lived in constant anxiety over whether they were reading the right books and newspapers and whether they had stopped phoning certain people in time to avoid a denunciation. All these hoops that they had to jump through in order to try and stay free. There were some people who were thankful when they were finally arrested. Sheesh, now I can stop worrying about it. Now that that's over with, at least I don't have to be anxious about whether I'm going to get arrested or not, or about whether I'm saying the right things or pleasing the right people. Stalin is probably the most powerful man who ever lived. This man commanded so much fear, nobody would utter his name unless it was for unending praise. It is understandable why some people say that what went wrong in the Soviet Union was this cult of personality around Stalin, who enforced a top-down tyranny of fear. People worshipped statues of Stalin, kissing his face and his feet in order to avoid suspicion or denunciation. Your neighbors could report on you if you turned off the radio during a government broadcast, or if you used a newspaper with Stalin's face on it as scrap paper. A carpenter was given a 10-year sentence for hanging his coat on a bust of Stalin. But not every prison sentence for anti-Soviet behavior was directly related to Stalin. A farmer once called a misbehaving cow a bad name. 15 years hard labor. After all, that's Soviet property that you just called a bad name. A journalist misspelled a word in a party slogan. 10 years in the gulags. You must understand, roughly 18 million Russians would pass through these labor camps over the course of 20 years, and millions of them would not make it to the other side of freedom. What happened in the Soviet Union is dismissed today as a cult of personality, a top-down tyranny enforced by fear and a cult-like worship of Stalin. It is true that Stalin had tremendous power and was not afraid to use it, but Solzhenitsyn will join the ranks of first-rate thinkers who say no. Stalin did not kill millions of people. Ordinary people killed millions of people. Solzhenitsyn will say the same thing as Viktor Frankl, and the same thing as Christopher Browning and many others. Totalitarianism triumphs when ordinary, everyday people decide to lie to themselves and others and run for cover instead of challenge what's happening. Stalin was only one man. It is the evil within every human heart that tyrants can capitalize on in order to realize their vision for society. And that's on us to cultivate virtue and fight for truth in order to make sure that doesn't happen here. Concerning the so-called cult of personality, Solzhenitsyn says many things, but this was the most striking to me. Quote, in 1945, traveling in a Stolypin car between Moscow and Kuybyshev, the one-legged German Schultz, having understood the Russian hurry up by this time, jumped to the toilet and back on his one leg while the convoy guard pushed him when he reached the platform at the end of the corridor. and Schultz fell down on the floor in front of the toilet. The convoy guard went into a rage and began to beat him, while Schultz, who couldn't get up because of the blows raining down on him, crawled and crept into the dirty toilet. The rest of the convoy roared with laughter. This, it seems, is what is meant by the phrase, Stalin's cult of personality. It would be too easy just to say, gosh, if only we could round up Stalin and his goons and kill them off, then there would be no more oppression. Solzhenitsyn says, no, you don't get it. That's what the revolution tried to do. And the most evil and murderous among all of us sifted to the top of the hierarchy and ended up running the country. You can't so easily separate the wheat from the chaff. Evil is not found in class distinctions or party lines or political views. If you killed Stalin, someone even worse than him would just replace him. Lenin did die, and Stalin replaced him. Evil is in the heart of every human being. Each individual person slowly decided that it was better for them to just make do, to just manage what was happening, or to even take advantage of the dimming light in Russia. And that's how an entire country becomes subjugated for nearly a century. There would be no executions if it weren't for the executioners, says Solzhenitsyn. It is the duty of each person to be virtuous, to stand up for the truth, and to not go along with the murderous or vengeful, angry mob. That's how you fight against tyranny. You stand up against the murderous and vengeful mob. In the gulags, 1 in every 6 prisoner was a trustee, and a trustee is an inmate who works for the guards. Solzhenitsyn says that they were crucial links in the chain of oppression. If everyone just collectively refused to join the guards when they became prisoners, the gulag system would have collapsed. They just didn't have enough personnel. But 1 in 6 people preferred power and safety over their fellow comrades. If you were the assistant to the man writing the denunciations, you're going to be safe from denunciations. People would prefer the extra food or leisure from being a trustee. And then once you're in, if you didn't falsify the records and lie to the administrators on behalf of chiefs to obtain benefits for yourself and the other trustees, you weren't really trusted. And so you became transferred to become a slogger, which means working for, general work, breaking your back in the coal mines, so to speak, or sometimes literally. Solzhenitsyn was a communist until he was in the gulags. It was in the gulags where the prisoners talked freely about religion and politics. And finally, Solzhenitsyn became disillusioned with the utopian ideal and their theory of good and evil. He says this, quote, "It was granted me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful successes, I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there, on rotting prison straw, that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates within the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Since then, I've come to understand the truth of all religions of the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it is possible to constrict it within each person." End quote. During Solzhenitsyn's time in the gulags, he realizes that ideology cannot solve man's inhumanity to man. You can't so easily divide the world into oppressors and victims. All of us are just stumbling along, trying to do our best. And I want to end our introduction to the Gulag Archipelago with a quote. This was from a speech that Solzhenitsyn gave in the 80s. He says, quote, "More than half a century ago, when I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all of this has happened. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own towards the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all of this has happened." End quote. I hope that you've enjoyed our excursion into the historical side of this important work, and next time we will explore Solzhenitsyn's spiritual and psychological journey. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast.